Hello everyone, I welcome you all in the course Introduction to Sequence Stratigraphy, and we are going through this series of lectures on different types of surfaces. So, we started our discussion with those surfaces which are associated with base level fall, and in that category we discussed about one of the major surface, the unconformity, in our previous class. In this class we are going to discuss about another very important surface which we call as correlative conformity. So, this correlative conformity is another surface which forms during the base level fall, and as the name suggests, it is correlative to the unconformity surface which is forming in the marginal marine part. That is why this term correlative is used in the naming of this particular surface, and this is a conformable surface, that is why this is a conformity surface. So, correlative conformity is again another very important surface in sequence stratigraphy, and in this class we are going to discuss about the detail of this particular surface. It forms within a complete or fully marine environment where during the base level fall that area is not getting exposed under this base level fall condition. So, even at the end of the base level fall, part of the basin is still under water depth, water cover, and sedimentation process is going on in that particular area. So, this surface approximates the paleo sea floor at the end of the force regression. So, this is the youngest clinoform associated with offlap. Already we have discussed that offlap forms during force regression. So, this is the youngest clinoform associated with offlap, and it correlates with the seaward termination of the subaerial unconformity. So, we can understand this with a simple diagram. I think in that case it will be much easier to understand that what we actually mean by this surface correlative conformity. So, let us think of one basinal condition. So, this is the fluvial part and this is the basin, and within this basin this is the water level at time t1. Now, this water level is falling and it is falling to level 2 at time t2, and in that way it is going down. For this second level of water, what will happen? The fluvial graded profile will try to adjust to this level, and due to this the sediments which were deposited earlier for this level T1, say for example this much of sediments. So, they will now get eroded up to this level because this is the new surface and we get a new surface of erosion formed over here. For this new T2, we get the next phase of deposition like this, and it will gradually go on for the successive phases of deposition like this. So, these are the phases of sea level fall or base level fall at successive phases. Now, when you are reaching say T4 is the end of the forced regression. So, this is the end of forced regression. So, at this point what is happening now, what we can observe over here, there are two different surfaces have formed. One, this surface which is formed through erosion due to the subaerial unconformity that has formed by adjustment of the fluvial graded profile during this base level fall. This we have already discussed in our previous class, that how unconformity will form. So, fluvial incision will go on, soil forming processes will go on. So, all these things are associated over there. Now, in this part, in this area, what we are getting, this unconformity is continuing, and that unconformity is going through successive offlapping surfaces. As you can see over here, these are the offlapping surfaces as they are produced by erosion, subaerial erosion due to successive phases of fall of the base level. Now, in this part of the basin, even after this much of fall of the base level, this is still underwater, and as per the depth condition prevailing over there, some sedimentation is going on along this surface or below this surface. So, when this forced regression is ending up over here, what we are getting? This surface is present, this particular surface is present, which marks the end of the forced regression in this part of the basin. Whereas, in the landward side of the basin or in the marginal part of the basin, the end of forced regression is marked by this surface, which is nothing but an unconformity. So, this unconformity in the landward side is actually correlative to this particular surface, which is formed in the marine part of the basin, where continuous sedimentation was going on. And on this surface is now becoming the substrate for the next phase of deposition, which will take place during the rise of the base level. Maybe this is T5 when the sea level is coming up over here. So, for this much of increase in the water depth, we will get some aggradation and new sediments of LST will form over here. For this LST, this is the surface, this is the substrate of deposition. So, this surface is called as the correlative conformity surface. So, correlative conformity surface is a correlative surface with respect to the subaerial unconformity. Subaerial unconformity is representing the forced regression in the landward direction, in the landward side, in the marginal marine part. The same event is represented in a different way through a conformable succession, because here in this part of the succession no erosion is going on. It is continuously underwater and continuously some sedimentary processes are going on over here. Yes, definitely the facies types will vary, because as the water level is gradually falling, the depositional systems, the depositional conditions will change their positions laterally. So, definitely we will get different types of facies distribution within these areas, several type of facies distribution, but there will be a conformable succession below this surface as well as above this surface, because there is no gap in sedimentation, there is no erosion is going on over here. So, this surface is called as a correlative conformity surface, which marks the end of the forced regression in the basinal part, in the marine part of the basin. So, correlative conformity separates the forced regressive deposits below from the low stand normal regressive deposits above. So, as you can see over here, these portions, these are the forced regressive deposits which are formed during this forced regressive phase. So, we can call them as the falling stage systems tract, and they are overlain by, this particular surface is overlain by the normal regressive. We know low stand systems tract, this is a normal regressive deposit. So, forced regressive deposits of FSST will be overlain by normal regressive deposits of LST. This is the characteristic of correlative conformity surface. And also what we can see over here, this surface is downlapping. As we can see, this was the earlier surface on which this surface is downlapping. So, this surface is downlapping on the earlier surface, earlier substrate which is present. So, the correlative conformity is very much characteristically represents an overall coarsening upward succession. When it is the underlying part, it is a forced regressive deposit, but it is a progradational succession. So, it will be coarsening upward succession. It is overlain by LST, which is a normal regressive deposit. So, again it is a coarsening upward progradational deposit. So, across this surface we do not expect any change in the depositional pattern, any change in the strata stacking pattern. There is another school which tried to identify the correlative conformity in a different way. So, they tried to identify the correlative conformity as the paleo sea floor at the onset of forced regression. So, as per their model, this is the surface which was present at the onset of the base level fall, at the onset of the forced regression. So, as per that school, they said this surface indicates the correlative conformity. But with modern ideas, as the subject has developed and the ideas have came up, this particular surface is no more considered as correlative conformity, but it is considered as basal surface of forced regression. So, we will discuss about this particular surface, the basal surface of forced regression, in our next class. So, the correlative conformity, it can be considered as the end of fall paleo seafloor. So, basically we are looking at this particular surface which is marking the position of the paleo seafloor at the end of fall. So, the end of fall paleo seafloor is the correlative conformity surface. So, it has a high preservation potential because it is not associated with any kind of erosions, and though it is associated with the falling stage of the base level, but immediately after this base level started rising, and that rise leads to aggradation of sediments, not erosion of sediments. So, due to this aggradation, which is the prevalent depositional trend just after the correlative conformity, so in most of the cases correlative conformity surface is preserved very well in sedimentary succession. But in a short phase succession, the correlative conformity is very difficult to identify on individual single logs. As I have told you, across this surface, below the package is an FSST, falling stage systems tract, and when it is a continuous sedimentation without any erosion, the falling stage systems tract is nothing but a coarsening upward succession. Just above the correlative conformity surface, we get another coarsening upward succession, which is the LST package, which is a normal regressive package. So, when we are looking at single log, individual single log, there throughout the succession will get stacked coarsening upward successions, which is characteristic of any normal regressive or forced regressive package, and it is very difficult to pinpoint the exact position of the correlative conformity surface in that kind of log. So, the use of this end of fall marine surface as the conformable portion of the sequence boundary has been proposed by several workers, several new proponents of this subject through this idea of depositional sequence 3, depositional sequence 4, and in those cases the correlative conformity is commonly identified as a separate surface which does not correlate with the seaward termination of the subaerial unconformity, because subaerial unconformity marks the end phase, last phase of the erosion going on in the landward side. Whereas, in the correlative conformity, when you are looking into the basinward side, there some other event has occurred which have got preserved within the rock succession. So, these two surfaces are commonly separated by a package of strata, which is the forced regressive deposits. So, again we can refer to one very simple diagram to explain this. Say for example, again that same marginal marine part followed by the basinal part, and during this, say this was the time T1, and from there the sea level or base level has come down to this one. So, maybe this is T2. So, during this entire phase of fall, what we can expect, the fluvial equilibrium profile has tried to come down over here, adjustment over here, and because of this there has been successive stages of depositions like this. So, what we are getting over here? We are getting one surface, the final surface. So, the erosion started from here, this point, and this part of the material, this part of the deposits which are present are removed through fluvial incision process, and finally what we are getting is this particular surface. Now, in the fluvial part or in the marginal marine part, this can be the interfluve area and the channel system like this. So, the interfluve areas, there we get the surface in the form of paleosols or maybe just a bypass surface, and in the channels we get this kind of erosional surfaces. So, whatever be the case, we are getting this final surface as the unconformity surface, which is demarcating actually the end of the process going through that has started from here to here, this entire process going on over here. And finally, in the rock record, it is represented by this one single surface, the final surface of erosion. So, when we look into the deeper part or the basinal part, what is happening over here? This part of the sediments are removed because this is now subaerially exposed and they are forming this kind of offlap surfaces, which is a continuation of the subaerial unconformity. But when we try to correlate that with this particular surface, which is the end of fall surface, the correlative conformity, so this surface is indicating the deposition of this much of sediments, which were deposited during this phase of fall. So, actually the start of the erosion, which is demarcated over here, is equivalent to this surface. This is the surface was present at T1. So, erosion started from here at T1. The surface is reaching over here through erosion at T2. So, on this surface, finally when you are looking at the rock record, T1 and T2 are juxtaposed due to erosion. Whereas, when we are looking into the deep basinal part or in the marine part of the basin, there we are getting two surfaces like this. This first one indicating T1 when the base level has started falling, and the second one is the end of the fall when the base level falling has stopped and it has started rising. So, this is the correlative conformity formed at T2. So, this package of sediment is present, which we call as the falling stage systems tract, the forced regressive package of strata formed within this particular area within these two surfaces. This surface is the basal surface of forced regression in most of the cases. However, it can vary, it can be other surface as well like RSME surface, that we will discuss later on, but the top surface is the correlative conformity surface. So, very commonly we use this term correlative conformity as equivalent to this unconformity surface, but it is not actually, it is not directly correlative. Where it is correlative? In terms of the end of the forced regression. The unconformity surface is also marking the end of the forced regression, and correlative conformity is also marking the end of the forced regression, end of fall phase. So, at that point these two are correlative, but if I want to match or compare with respect to the processes which are involved, they are not correlative to each other. In most of the cases, particularly when we are trying to interpret from rock successions, correlative conformity is a problem surface in sequence stratigraphy, because it is surrounded by controversies regarding its timing and physical attributes. It is very difficult to recognize. This is the first problem that we face when we deal with correlative conformity, because this is very difficult to recognize in outcrops, in core sections or even in wildland logs, because it is lying in between stacked coarsening upward successions. However, if we look into relatively larger scale, particularly in basin scale profiles, there we can find out some surfaces like that one I drawn over here, like this kind of stratal stacking patterns and this kind of surfaces where the overlying onlapping package may be like this. So, there we can identify this kind of surfaces as a correlative conformity surface. So, if we are getting this kind of regional data, maybe in terms of seismic profiles, that can infer the approximate position as the clinoform that correlates with the basinward termination of the subaerial unconformity. The salomarine portions of the correlative conformity, they develops within a conformable prograding package. So, it is a coarsening upward trend below and above. So, in these cases, when this kind of forced regressive packages are forming, definitely the overall depositional system is gradually shifting towards the oceanward side with change in the energy condition. So, lithophases within these coarsening upward successions, they will vary, but they all will be confined or they all will be representing similar kind of depositional systems without much contrast. So, lithophase contrast, grading contrast are lacking in this kind of succession, which makes our task more difficult for identification of the correlative conformity surfaces. Now, as the water level is decreasing, base level is falling. So, commonly these areas, particularly those are forming under falling stage systems tract, they are associated with high energy conditions. And under such high energy conditions, substrate controlled ichnophases are commonly not present, commonly not found. So, correlative conformity is not associated with any characteristic substrate controlled ichnophases. And since they are associated with again the marine deposits overlying them, so we do not get any contrasting juxtaposed deposits where we get some other type of ichnofabric or contrasting ichnofabric across the surface. So, again from ichnofabric or ichnophase point of view also, we do not expect much variation, much contrasting characteristics or identifying characteristics for correlative conformity. Now, we can move on to the deep marine environment, and in deep marine environment, which is continuously under water cover, considerable amount of water cover in fact, and there we get some variations in the depositional process and the resultant phases along with this variation in the water depth. So, in the deep marine environment, what we get is as the base level is falling, the source of sediment is gradually coming closer to the deep marine part as the base level is falling and the shoreline is moving towards the shelf. So, in those cases, the correlative conformity is proposed to be mapped at the top of the prograding and coarsening upward submarine fan complex. When the sediment source is very nearby, we get plenty of sediment supplied into the system and we get successive stacking of submarine fan complexes in the deep marine part. So, when that process is over and we get the start of the aggradation during the LST phase, that submarine fan complex, its progradation, its coarsening upward trend is complete then, and we can identify the correlative conformity surface above that particular surface. The overlying gravity flow deposits, which commonly overlie the submarine fan complexes, tend to display a fining upward trend, because as the water level is now rising after this base level fall, when the base level has started rising, now the shoreline has started moving back, and as a result of that, the supply point of the sediments is retreating backward. So, the coarser sediments, their supply is getting more trapped towards the shallower part of the basin. So, deeper part is getting supply of relatively finer sediments, and as a result of that, what we get is a fining upward trend overlapping this submarine fan complex, which is a coarsening upward. So, that can help us to demarcate the correlative conformity surface in the deep marine part, particularly in the submarine fan complexes. The mapping of the end of fall surface, the correlative conformity surface within the deep water phases is in fact much more difficult, because there first of all the contrast in terms of the depositional systems, contrast in terms of 3D distribution of phases is not that much. Mostly it is controlled by the main depositional pattern is controlled by successive mass flow deposits, turbidity currents and other mass flow type deposits, for example gravity flow. But along with that, we can get further variations in terms of sediment supply, the nature of the gravity flow, the intensity of the gravity flow and associated vertical profiles, because all these things are actually controlled by, are actually dependent on multiple of other factors which include, for example, how much is the slope, how much is the sediment supply from the landward side, how much is the energy condition, what is the strength of the gravity flow. So, all these factors together control that what will be the nature of gravity flow deposits in the deep marine part, and this can vary from area to area irrespective of the base level change. So, maybe during base level fall, at the peak of the base level fall, we can get many variations across the entire self slope break, self slope edge, depending on what type of sediments were available at that particular point at that particular area. So, identifying correlative conformity in the deep marine part, in the deep basinal part, in terms of simply identifying coasting upward trend of the submarine fan complex and the overlying finding upward trend of the gravity flow deposits may not work everywhere. We have to look for the overall depositional pattern, we have to look for other parameters which are characteristic of that particular basin before we go for demarcation of the correlative conformity surface in the deep basinal part. So, we can conclude over here that correlative conformity again is a very important surface in sequence stratigraphy, and it helps us to identify the end of fall stage in the basinal part, particularly in the marine basinal part, where in between a continuous succession of strata which is dominantly coasting upward strata, we can find out a surface in terms of nature of the facies aggregation, in terms of the facies associations, and in terms of the nature of stratal stacking pattern. Commonly this surface is correlated to as equivalent with the subaerial unconformity which is forming in the landward side, which is forming in the marginal marine part through successive offlapping phases. But when we truly look into the mechanism of formation of this particular surface, it is not exactly correlatable to the unconformity, because unconformity marks the end of the erosion, end of the base level fall, whereas this surface demarcates the end of the deposition of the falling stage systems tract. So, we get a sediment package which is lying in between these two surfaces, start of the fall and end of the fall. Unconformity surface is demarcating both start and end of the fall, whereas the correlative conformity demarcates the end of the fall within a sedimentary succession in the marine part of the basin. Identification of correlative conformity is problematic, so we have to be very much careful. We have to go through regional scale correlations using several outcrop sections or maybe several well log sections, and based on that correlation and with proper interpretation of the depositional facies, we can go for a proper interpretation and identification of correlative conformity surface. But if we can identify the correlative conformity surface, it can very clearly demarcate the time of end of fall in the basinal part, and that can come up as a very important surface for building up the sequence and the corresponding systems tracts in the deep basinal part of the basin. So, these are some of the references that you can go through for further reading on this particular topic. So, thank you everybody.